All right, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to give a couple minutes to let a couple more people in, and then we'll get started for our provider convening today. All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I am Carrie Volter. I'm the Associate Director of Crisis Services at the BHA. What you see right now is our agenda for the day. We've got a couple presentations for you today. We'll start with the introduction of our provider convening team, and then we have presentation on the ASAM 4, the 988 Colorado involuntary commitments. And depending on time, I will do a short presentation on our crisis curriculum. Just want to remind everybody that the meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be linked on the BHA website next week for future reference and looking back. Next screen, please.
Hi, everyone. Just a few housekeeping items. I'm Jill Davis. I'm with Statewide Programs as a program assistant. Today's ASL interpreters are Heidi and Liz, and you can spotlight them so that they will appear larger on your screen. You can do that by hovering over the right corner of the ASL video and select Pin if you would like to see them larger on your screen. We are a large group today. Everybody is muted by default. And there will be a limit. Today is a tight program, so we are asking you to please put your questions in the chat, and we will likely answer questions after each presentation. If a question cannot be answered due to time, or we need to ask some other questions, then somebody will follow up with you via email within 48 hours. Melissa will be monitoring the chat today and keeping us on track there. And all links will be shared in the chat, and files will be shared at the end of the meeting and available on the website within 3 to 5 days. I'll turn it over to Webster.
Thank you. And I want to quickly remind you that the purpose of these meetings is the statewide programs team will be convening and hosting these meetings in an effort to inform providers and update providers regarding all of the different services and other changes that are happening across the system. It also gives you an opportunity for ongoing engagement and provider contributions to the things that are happening across the system. Next slide. Also want to remind you and I guess remind you that our mission is to co-create a people-first behavioral health system that meets the needs of all people in Colorado. And we welcome you and thank you for joining us in this mission. I think Mark.
Right. So our BHA team, our executive leadership, is anyone on the call today that can introduce yourselves, or I will go through the list?
I think they've all been pulled into other meetings with legislators and whoever.
All right. Well, we have our Commissioner, Jeanette R. Smith, and our Deputy Commissioner of Engagement, Kelly Causey, Deputy Commissioner of Systems and Programs, Aaron Wester, and our Chief Financial Officer is Stephen Peng. I imagine if they get a break, they'll probably jump in here, but you probably are pulled into additional meetings at this time. If we can go to the next screen, we can talk about our statewide program director. That's Mark. If you want to introduce yourself, Mark, because I see you.
I'm here. Hi, everybody. Mark Honajani, he, him pronouns. And yes, Director of Statewide Programs. Really excited to be here. Thanks for joining us. And I can hand it over to the rest of the team. If Danielle's here.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Danielle Culp, and I'm the Director of Statewide Programs Process and Justice Involvement. So happy to be here. I'll pass it over to either Paul, Val, or back to you, Carrie.
Paul, you want to introduce yourself, or Val? You guys are both here today. They're being quiet and shy today. So we have Paul as our Director of Child
myself.
Oh, there you are, Paul.
Hi, sorry about that. Thanks for unmuting me. Paul Barnett, he, him, Director of Child, Youth, and Family Services here at BHA, and glad to be here. And I'll pass it to Val.
Hi, everyone. Valerie Resendez having a little bit of technical issues, so I apologize for that, but I am the other co-interim Director for Adult Treatment and Recovery. And then our provider convening team, if y'all like to jump in.
I'll go ahead and start. I am Webster Hendrickwith, Program Manager of the Criminal Justice Services Program.
I am Melissa Morales. I'm the Statewide Programs Program Assistant.
I'm Shane Orm. I use he, him pronouns, and yeah, I'm Program Assistant as well.
Jill Davis, she, her, and I'm a PA for criminal justice.
I am Sammy Warner, and I am the TADA program assistant, and I go by she, her pronouns.
Thank you all. Really appreciate it. You keep us on track and keep this provider convening moving. You could do next slide. Thank you, Jill. You're already on it. We have Mariana. She's going to do the next presentation here on the ACM criteria, 4th edition. Turn it over to you, Mariana.
Thank you, Carrie, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mariana Sears. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a safety net licensing manager with the Behavioral Health Administration. Today, I have a very brief report out for you about our first virtual listening session. Thank you. We wanted to let you all know that the Behavioral Health Administration and Healthcare Policy and Finance hosted our first ACM4 specific listening session. This occurred on July 23rd of 2024. The target audience for this particular event were stakeholders interested in withdrawal management services within the 4th edition of the ACM criteria. So for that particular event, we had close to 40 unique participants. It was a little bit tricky to count as we had some shared logins, so we weren't necessarily sure everybody that was there, but 40 for sure that we know we were able to count. And this included both providers, consultants, state and regulatory systems. So really a good swath of stakeholders who would need to be part of this change process. As far as takeaways go, the majority of the discussion was around confusion, concern about what this alignment and changes may entail for withdrawal management focused providers, what options might exist, how could we potentially build out our continuum of services, making sure that we're not negatively impacting communities as much as possible. So we ended the virtual listening session by identifying that there is continued interest in exploring these boundaries and opportunities together in a work group type setting. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. Really what we left with is we are going to move forward with a withdrawal management focused work group. Our intention with this is to convene beginning this fall, and our goal is to begin sometime in September of 2024. We really want this to be action-oriented and a time-limited work group that is focusing on this withdrawal management need within the 4th edition. And so right now, where we are, BHA and HCPF are working together to develop parameters for this work group. That was an ask from the listening session, is to come back with bumpers and parameters so that we know within that work group what our options are, and we can work to decide what we need to do from there. So far, we are accepting interest in, if individuals are interested in participating, please let us know. You can see, thank you, Shane, for popping that into the chat. We're accepting information about individuals who are interested in participating and being part of this time-limited work group, either through the BHA's feedback email address, as well as HCPF's SUD benefits address. We also have here a couple links to the pages where the majority of information around these ASAM4 involved updates are going to live. For the BHA, that's going to be on the Laws and Rules website. And for Healthcare Policy and Finance, that is on their Ensuring Full Continuum SUD Benefits website. So if you contact us and say you're interested in this work group, we'll make sure to provide you some email updates before the month is out, and look forward to working together to make this everything we can make it be in September of 2024. That's all for me.
Thank you, Mariana. I don't see any questions in the chat, but we are ahead of schedule. So I just want to give a minute. If anybody has any questions for Mariana, we can address those now, or if it comes up later, we can address them at the end. I know I'm asking people to type really quickly if they have something they want to add into the chat. Okay, if something comes up, we will address that at the end, or Mariana will get with you if we run out of time at the end. We move on to 988 Colorado, our introduction, and we have Kelly Bowman and Chloe Rico.
Thanks, Carrie. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, let's hope my internet actually stays on this time. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kelly Bowman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the 988 Enterprise and Crisis Line Program Manager with Behavioral Health Administration. Very excited to give some updates on 988. I want to apologize in advance because this is a lot of information. I tend to talk fast and I get very excited about this program. So if there's any questions, we'll have time at the end. And again, we'll have our contact information if we need to do a deeper dive directly. So with that, let's go ahead and get into it. If we go to the next slide, please. So it was actually back in 2020 that the FCC adopted rules to establish 988 as the new nationwide 3-digit phone number for Americans in crisis to connect with suicide prevention and crisis experts. In preparation for the launch of 988 in Colorado, we passed Senate Bill 21-154, which established the 988 Crisis Hotline Enterprise as a business enterprise within CDHS. So the Hotline Enterprise is governed by a governor-appointed board of directors, and this historical legislation is monumental for many reasons, but most importantly, the creation of the enterprise created a structure that will provide sustainable funding for 988 services in Colorado. Colorado's 988 funding is through a 988 surcharge to wireless and prepaid wireless phone bills. This is actually, we were one of, I believe, the first 4 states that passed this type of legislation. So thank you to everyone who is contributing to 988 services in Colorado. Our team has the privilege of working very closely with our board of directors on all things 988, including how we communicate with audiences like you. And what's important for you all to know is that our board meetings are open to the public. If you go to the CDHS public calendar, you'll see that they're held at least monthly, although we have a very interactive board that loves to schedule more meetings. So we always hold public comment, and we really welcome community feedback on the operations of 988 in those meetings. So please look to attend those in the future. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, 988 is the easy to remember number that allows anyone with emotional, mental health, or substance use concerns to be immediately connected to a trained specialist who will listen without judgment. 988 is free, it's confidential, and available 24/7. 988 connects to a national network of accredited 988 Lifeline contact centers across the country. There's about 215, I believe, at this point. And throughout this presentation, you're going to hear me use the term trained specialist instead of crisis counselor. This shift in language was actually directly informed by a lot of research, 2 years of research that Colorado has done about certain verbiage associated with getting support. And the word crisis is something that we're kind of trying to remove because there's still so much stigma attached with it. Prior to 988, this network was known as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It's since rebranded nationally to the National Suicide and Crisis Line. As you see on my slides, it shows we call it 988 Colorado Mental Health Line. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But this shift was actually embraced because we knew that there was a need to increase immediate support with a more inclusive approach that was also very proactive. We know that crisis, struggle, and pain looks very different for each individual. 988 embraces that individuality and says that whatever the challenge may be, we're here for you. We are three numbers, zero judgment. We also serve individuals of all ages, including youth, because we don't provide therapy. 988 is not therapy. And because of that, the age of consent does not apply. We are able to serve our youth in the same way that we've been serving them through Colorado Crisis Services, regardless of age of consent. And that doesn't mean that we're going to contact parents either. So this is something that's really important for confidentiality to engage our youth. BHA and the 988 Crisis Hotline Enterprise have been working very closely together to develop, support, and promote Colorado's 988 mental health line. So alongside with Colorado Crisis Services, 988 provides immediate support for mental health services to those folks in Colorado. And you're going to hear us talk a lot about, because we have CCS, because we have 988, there's no wrong door for that support. Next slide, please. We are very excited to share an update on routing for those of you who have been tracking what's going on with 988. So 988 contacts are currently today routed by your phone area code. So what that means is for transplants like me, I have a 517 area code that is for Michigan. If I were to call 988 today, I would get sent to the contact center in Michigan. And every contact center does have protocols in place to reroute in the event of an emergency or the need for local support, but that's not ideal. So we, as BHA and 988 Crisis Hotline Enterprise, have been very closely working with FCC and other key partners on how do we address this issue. So we're very excited to share that in fall of this year, there's going to be some changes to 988 routing for 988 calls, and that is going to be for geo-routing. Geo-routing is the technology that routes 988 callers based off their approximate physical location versus the area code. But to be very, very clear, there's a big difference between geo-routing and geolocation. Geolocation is that automated location information. This is what a lot of folks assume we have. This is closely associated with 911, that we can actually trace where someone is physically located. What we are implementing for 988 beginning this fall is going to be geo-routing. So what will happen with geo-routing is if I were to call this fall, when I call 988, that means that even though I'm physically sitting in Colorado Springs right now, when I call, I'm going to get sent to our contact center that's in Colorado, not to Michigan. But that doesn't mean that they're going to be able to see where I'm at in Colorado Springs. And this is important because it doesn't reveal the precise location of help seekers. This is something that we get asked about a lot. Who's going to show up if I call 988? Can you see my location? That is a big barrier for a lot of folks and feeling very fearful of that. So we want to acknowledge it and get them closely connected to the contact center that has those local resources in place. And this is an additional step to ensure that privacy by only giving general location data for routing calls. So what we have been told as of last week is that those routing changes for the big three carriers, T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T, that will go into effect by end of October. Next slide, please. So what is the difference between, or should I contact 988 or Colorado Crisis Services? For those of you who are familiar with Colorado Crisis Services, it's our statewide crisis response system that's been in existence since 2014. We have our 10-digit phone number as well as our text line and a peer support line. Those things are not going away. Again, there is no wrong door for that immediate crisis support. The difference is simply national versus local. We do have, obviously, our CCS network that's answered locally. 988, we have our contact center that is housed locally. And so there's really no wrong door. And our commitment in Colorado is whether someone calls in through Colorado Crisis Services or through 988, we want their experience and connection to resources to be consistent. And that was actually addressed in that legislation that I mentioned before, SB 21-154. It's actually a requirement for our contact center that answers the 988 Lifeline contacts to refer to our walk-in centers, to our mobile crisis teams when it's appropriate. So we really want that continuity piece. There's several different ways that you can get in contact with 988. There's call, text, and chat at 988lifeline.org. And even though we do ask on that front end, we're going to ask name, pronouns, that type of information so that our trained specialists know how to address someone. It is up to the caller, texter, chatter to decide what type of information they want to share. You don't have to share identifying information in order to get support. We're going to meet you where you're at. We only ask that information to kind of better figure out how we can address someone. But again, it is up to the user to decide how little or how much they want to share. We're going to serve them no matter what. We also wanted to share with this group that yes, a live human is behind every interaction. This includes text and chat. So the initial response via chat and text is going to be automated, but it is direct connected with a trained specialist who can see those responses. So it's not kind of that AI world. It's just an automated response, but it's getting connected to a live human. And every individual has pretty extensive training that is reviewing those text chats, those contacts there. There is a pretty, again, intensive training that is several weeks long, coaching, supervision, support that they go through in order to be able to effectively respond to the various crisis situations that folks call in for. Again, even though we provide, even though we ask some demographic information, we may ask and document the information that is collected from the individual accessing crisis support. The contact center, state, and 988 Lifeline network have rigorous protections in place to ensure that those 988 contacts remain confidential. That is a staple of the intervention and support that we provide. One last thing that we didn't address directly in our slides, but wanted to mention, one of the other differences that 988 can provide versus the Colorado Crisis Services is some of our specialty lines. So there's a veterans call and text line that you'll hear about. You can access the LGBTQ youth and young adult support line as well as text line. That is for youth 25 and under. We also have support for ASL deaf and hard of hearing through the chat feature and video phone services. And we also have Spanish speaking chat and text. So those are some enhanced supports that are available across the country related to 988. I know I'm running close on time, so I want to get to the next slide and turn it over to Chloe to talk a little bit about some of our marketing and messaging efforts.
Thank you, Kelly. Hello, everyone. My name is Chloe Rico. I use she, her pronouns. I am on the marketing team here at BHA and working really closely on the 988 team. And I'm really excited to present some exciting updates on our campaign. Next slide, please. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So as many of you might know, we launched our marketing campaign on July 8th. And so we're kind of almost 2 months into this new marketing campaign. Yes, 988 was available starting in July of 2022, but we really took the last year and a half to understand our community's needs, make sure we understood what they needed in terms of a support line, how they wanted the branding to look and feel, what the naming structure would look like Kelly mentioned, what languages we wanted available, just really finding out like how people had been using support lines in the past and how, and if they had not, what they would need from them. So really understanding how we could create our own messaging. SAMHSA gave us the funding, but we have been able to be the creative, like we can create our own branding here in Colorado that speaks to our community's needs. So all that to say, we landed on Colorado Mental Health Line. We do have a website I did put in the chat where you can order materials as well as download materials. So we do offer free print materials to share with your community as well as digital materials if that is helpful. You can always reach out to us. We do have a contact us page as well on the website, but that link will take you to a Dropbox with all of our assets. We also have posters that everything is in English and in Spanish. Much of this was informed by the community. We were able to submit or send out in a survey, but also in focus groups. What does the brand look like? What would resonate most with your community? And what would make sense in terms of, messaging, and making sure that we're talking about it with the community's needs prioritized. So next slide, please. Okay, and here on your screen, you will see a small snippet of the Colorado dashboard for 988 that really allows members of the public to have information about the use of 988 as well as our other crisis services here in Colorado. So feel free to visit the website on the bottom right. We can also link it in the chat. You can see data related to calls answered, average answer rate, and then also there is some opportunities to get pretty granular with the data. If you ever have any questions, we have an awesome data team that's been able to do this so that we can make sure that our contact center is meeting the needs of our community, as well as we're keeping people up to date on the data and what people are calling about, reaching out about, so that people have that information. It is updated on a quarterly basis. We've been updating it a little bit more regularly because it is such a new program. So that we can really allow people to have an accurate picture of current metrics. So next slide, please. This is really quick. I'm not going to go over it in great depth, but we are providing this to a lot of our community members and has came back as necessary, and kind of a ask of the community is really to be able to provide person first language when people are talking about needing immediate emotional support, talking about substance use, talking about mental health needs and concerns, and really making sure that we are prioritizing that person first language and making sure that we are addressing people appropriately and talking about different concerns that people have in our community with respect. And so that's really important for us. We have offered this available in our toolkit so people can download it. If anyone asks questions or you have any feedback, we're always open to receiving it. So next slide, please. Here we have provided a lot of people also asked, we were able in our last round of research to understand how people wanted to talk about the service, and really making sure getting the feedback in our first phase that crisis and suicide were not words that we wanted to describe the service. Was people really wanted to know what to expect when calling and how to reach out to the service. And so making sure that that is addressed in our call to action messages, as well as when we answer what is 988. You'll see in our FAQ on the website, as well as in many of our materials, that we make sure to answer both those questions. So what does that look like? What is 988? So that people really know that awareness. We, in our research, came back that 5% of people of Colorado knew about 988. So we have a lot of opportunity to grow and to raise awareness within our communities. And part of that is making sure that we have that available to people to answer those questions in community. Next slide, please. I'm going to I know there's quite a few questions in the chat, and I know people probably have questions. So this is really what we were offered. We did host a community informed session a few weeks ago, and Kelly and I were able to invite over 200 community members to join us for an information session. Hopefully many of you were also there, but it really allowed us to share 988 for those who didn't know about it, to answer some questions for those that did, and then make sure that people knew how that they could share this in their community. And one of the big pieces of that was people didn't know and felt very much in the research that 988 was for someone else and not for themselves, and externalizing that need to be connected to the service. And so our goal really here is to make sure that people know about the service and they have it in their toolkit or toolbox of resources, and that they know how to talk about it. That was a big piece of feedback with a lot of the community partners and people that do provide services or behavioral health like referrals. And that was understanding like exactly what the service provided so that they could talk well about it and that they knew exactly how to answer people's questions. So some of the feedback, we are producing some materials so people can know the signs and they can identify them, because that came back a lot, that people weren't sure when 988 would be appropriate. And so making sure that we could, answer those questions and allow them the opportunity and invite them to use the service or to at least mention it to someone that might need it. Next slide, please. So yeah, here's everything. Kelly Bowman has put her information here if you would like to contact any of us. We also have a 988 shared inbox that goes to all of us working on the team that I can share in the chat, or Kelly can as well. But really just making sure that if you hear any feedback in the community, we really have created additional educational materials as well as various digital materials so that people have those available to themselves. And really prioritizing community engagement. We are doing a huge effort right now to be in community, to be answering people's questions, to be at events, at conferences, at community-wide events, back to school events, especially with Suicide Prevention Month coming up, really prioritizing where we can be in the community and where we can be making connections and relationships. So we were going to continue to do that. We hope you will join us. And if you have any questions or you receive any feedback, we are always open to hearing about it and making sure that 988 is a service for all. Next slide, please. And then, yeah, we just wanted to open it up very briefly for some questions. If anyone has any, please let us know.
Thanks, Chloe. It looks like we did get a question about, is Solari answering these calls and were RMCP staff able to be hired by Solari? So for context, for anyone who is not aware, 988 and Colorado Crisis Line, we went through an RFP earlier this year, and we did award a different vendor, Solari, who will be officially taking over services on September 1st. Currently, Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners is continuing to participate through a transition period through 8/31. So to give you an update on the hiring, yes, Solari will be answering 988 contacts beginning September 1st. And they have done an amazing job of recruiting and trying to onboard several of the Rocky Mountain Crisis Partner staff members who are interested in working. We did a lot of effort behind the scenes to prioritize staff incentives to make that transition. So the majority of the workforce that Solari has recruited and is in the process of onboarding is Rocky Mountain Crisis Partner staff. We wanted to keep that institutional knowledge. And a couple of other key pieces that we typically get asked about. I wanted to clarify that Solari's operations for 988 contact center services are actually going to physically be located in Colorado. In fact, they're actually going to be in the exact same space that Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners previously was operating in. So they will be a Colorado-based 988 contact center, and they have prioritized having a Colorado-based workforce. We are still allowing for some remote work because we did that with RMCP. We had over approximately about a third of our workforce at RMCP was remote. So we're still allowing that flexibility for recruiting and retaining staff. But yes, the majority of the workforce that they have onboarded is previous RMCP staff members. Let's see if we have any other. Sorry, trying to pull up the chat again and I can't get it to open.
Kelly, I can read it to you. With crisis teams required to document providing resources such as the Colorado Crisis Line and text line, does 988 call text web replace / meet that obligation?
So I'm trying to think of what that specific requirement is. If it's similar to, there used to be some language in our crisis contracts that explicitly said that folks either had to promote CCS, not the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That has since been removed. So we are allowing community to decide which resource makes the most sense for them. So we usually are asking for folks to we're not saying that you can't promote 988, I guess is the long and the short of it. There used to be very clear language that said that you could not promote the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. It could only be CCS. You can promote 988 as well. That is not something that we are going to be saying communities cannot provide. We're going to have a lot more, we'll have a lot stronger of a presence with 988 marketing and messaging than we do CCS. And so if and when we decide to kind of sunset what that 10-digit line and the peer line is going to look like, we will let you guys know. But for right now, thank you, Elizabeth. It's still required that you guys have to promote CCS if you are a CCS contractor, but you can also promote 988. There is no longer that specific language saying that you cannot promote what used to be known as the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. So it sounds like you do still have to promote CCS, but you can also share information on 988. Again, the intention behind that is really making sure that whether or not someone calls 988 or CCL, their experience and connection is going to be consistent. Is there anything else?
I'm not seeing anything.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for your time today. Again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you, Kelly and Chloe. We can move on to our next presentation. We will have Brooke Applegate presenting on involuntary commitment today. Brooke, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Hello.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Brooke Applegate. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the Involuntary Commitment Program coordinators and trainers. Today, we are going to be talking about the emergency and involuntary commitment process for substance use disorder. So to begin, let's define what the involuntary commitment for substance use disorder is. In Colorado, an individual can be committed to a substance use treatment facility if a judge orders it through what is called the involuntary commitment process. This process is considered to be a civil commitment that goes through the civil courts. If it's granted, the civil commitment is an order from the judge for that person to complete substance abuse treatment that's determined by the Behavioral Health Administration. We would note that a civil commitment is different from criminal charges. Most of the time, if a client is facing criminal charges for substance use, we will not pursue an involuntary commitment, as those criminal charges are going to hold heavier consequences than the civil charges. Next slide. A little bit of history about the involuntary commitment program in Colorado. Effective July 1st, 1974, the Colorado legislature declared that alcoholics and intoxicated persons may not be subjected to criminal prosecution because of their consumption of alcoholic beverages, but rather should be afforded a continuum of treatment in order to possibly lead normal lives as productive members of society. Then in 2020, a bill was passed that combined the separate alcohol and drug statutes into one single integrated statute known as Colorado Revised Statute Title 27, Article 81. In that statute, the language was updated to substance use disorder to cover both drugs and alcohol. This statute also included updating the rights of persons receiving treatment, similar to those rights of clients in mental health involuntary holds under CRS 2765, and we're going to talk a little bit about those later. And then this updated statute also extended the initial commitment timeframe from 60 days to 90 days. So the total duration of an IC is now up to 9 months, which is a total of 270 days. Next slide. An emergency commitment, which is also referred to as an EC, is up to a 5-day hold, which is a total of 120 hours, that has to be authorized by a licensed withdrawal management facility. And it's for individuals that are considered to be intoxicated or incapacitated. The individual is either intoxicated or incapacitated and clearly a danger to the health and safety of themselves or others. This information does have to be supported with clear facts from a reputable source, and the information needs to be reviewed every 24 hours to ensure that the person on the emergency commitment continues to meet that criteria. If the person no longer meets criteria, the EC must be lifted and the client has to be moved to a voluntary status. A few things I would note about ECs is that most ECs are going to be initiated after a person has been medically cleared for something directly related to their substance use. And the other thing is that not all emergency commitments are going to turn into involuntary commitments. A majority of the ECs are going to be reviewed and dismissed before the involuntary commitments ever come into play. Next slide. Who can request an emergency commitment hold? And that's going to be any responsible person can submit a written application for an emergency commitment hold on a person that they're concerned about. So this can include law enforcement officers, physicians, spouses, guardians, relatives. Then we look at what makes that emergency commitment hold valid. And that emergency commitment hold must be initiated and maintained by a licensed withdrawal management facility in order for it to be valid. Next slide. As I previously mentioned, in 2020, that bill was passed and the statute was updated to incorporate the emergency commitment patient rights. This slide has a copy of those patient right forms. They can also be found on our website. And these are taken directly from Colorado Revised Statute 2781-114. These patient right forms have to be presented to the patient within 24 hours of detainment. They need to be presented both orally and written. And the respondents are required to sign these documents. However, we understand if they're unable to sign these documents for whatever reason, as they are intoxicated or incapacitated, then staff just needs to list a reason as to why the patient is unable to sign. And then the patient is also required to be given copies of this form. They're also required to be given the telephone and email address for the Office of the Ombudsman for Behavioral Health Access to Care. And the patient is required to be given the facility grievance or complaint process. Lastly, if the patient does not speak or understand English, these forms are required to be translated for that patient. So I know I've said this a few times before, but it's very important, so I'm going to say it again. If the grounds no longer exist for an emergency commitment, then the withdrawal management facility must dismiss the emergency commitment and that individual needs to be moved to a voluntary status or discharged from withdrawal management. Next slide. So now we're going to jump into the involuntary commitment process, which is known as the IC process. An involuntary commitment is a court order to substance use disorder treatment. As a result of this court order, the respondent is going to be placed in the custody of BHA in regards to treatment placement decisions only. So we don't have physical custody of them. This court order then can range anywhere from 90 to 270 days. And that's going to be based on the willingness for that individual to stipulate. And a stipulation is a written agreement between the person being placed on an IC and other parties involved. And that individual can agree to stipulate to 90, 180, or 270 days. Then treatment placement is going to be based off of recommendations after clinical assessments have been completed. Next slide. So who's appropriate for an involuntary commitment? This process should be used as a last option that's reserved for individuals who meet the following criteria. One, they need to present a danger to self or others as a result of their substance use. That they need to be refusing or not following through with voluntary treatment. They do need to have somewhat stable mental health symptoms. And when we talk about that, we're looking to see if this person is on medications and willing to take them, that they aren't displaying aggressive behaviors or they can be redirectable in their behaviors, and that it's not interfering with their ability to participate in treatment or causing them to be disruptful to other participants. They also need to be medically stable, and they also need to likely benefit from substance use disorder treatment when sober. And that last one is actually in statute, that they are required to be benefiting. Next slide. So individuals must meet the following three criteria. They have to have a substance use disorder, show signs of being a danger to themselves or others, or be incapacitated, and they need to be refusing voluntary treatment. Next slide. So when we talk about a substance use disorder, we're talking about a diagnosis. Typically, it's a severe diagnosis. It can be for drugs, it can be for alcohol, or it can be for multiple substances, including drugs and alcohol. Diagnosis can look at frequency and amount of use. Next slide. Then we talk about them being a danger to themselves or others, or being incapacitated by their substance use. When we're talking about this, we're looking at a time period of the last 6 months. It can include things such as lack of hygiene or lack of self-care, not eating, or other risky behaviors. Some other examples of risky behaviors can be high blood alcohol levels, accidents such as head traumas, falls, cuts, scrapes, driving under the influence, medical issues caused by their substance use, neglect of their medical care, can be overdoses or being found unconscious in public places. There's a whole list of things that can be considered for risky behavior. Next slide. And lastly, we need to be able to show that there is a refusal to go to treatment. So what we're looking at is either the person is refusing to do voluntary treatment, they are failing to complete treatment, such as they've gone to treatment and left before it's been finished. It can also be that they did finish treatment and then they immediately relapsed upon their release. Some questions we often ask petitioners are going to be, how often are you asking them if they want to get help? Or how long has that individual stayed in treatment before? Were their past treatment events successful? And then we also look at the times that they visited ERs or withdrawal managements, because each time that they're discharged from one of those facilities, we know that they're being provided with resources for treatment. Next slide. So who can petition for an involuntary commitment? And this is going to be any responsible person 18 years and older. So that can include spouses, guardians, physicians, clinicians, advanced practice nurses, police officers, co-responders. So that means all of you could be a petitioner potentially. Next slide. So let's talk about what the responsibilities of that petitioner are going to be. So this petitioner has to have firsthand knowledge of all that criteria I just talked about. That the substance use, how they're a danger to themselves or others, and their unsuccessful treatment. The petitioner is then going to take all that information and put it into an application that is submitted to BHA. So that's the first responsibility for them. The second responsibility is that after we get a legal petition drafted with the courts, they're going to be required to sign that legal petition, and most counties require that signature to be notarized. And lastly, the last responsibility of a petitioner is that if this case goes in front of a judge, that petitioner is going to be required to testify at that court hearing. Next slide. So this slide shows the 5 different steps that are involved in the involuntary commitment process, and I'm going to go into each step and talk a little bit about them. So next slide, step 1 is the emergency commitment, which I just kind of did a brief overview on. That this is the hold that's initiated by a professional person with the purpose of simultaneously pursuing the involuntary commitment process. This application is given to a licensed withdrawal management facility for approval. Then we go to step 2. Step 2 of the IC process is the involuntary commitment application. This is written by one petitioner, only one, that has that firsthand knowledge of the person's substance use disorder and how it's made them a danger to themselves or others, along with their failed treatment attempts. We would note that this application does have to be approved by BHA. That's to ensure that it has adequate information and would be appropriate to go forward with court. Then step 3 of this process is getting a physician certificate. BHA and the MSO, which is our managed service organization, we're going to help coordinate in getting this completed. The physician certificate is required to be signed by a medical doctor, so that's either a DO or an MD. And the physician signing off on this needs to know that they are subject to being called to testify at the IC hearing if it goes to court. If the doctor assessing the individual does not support the involuntary commitment, the case cannot file with the courts. The process is halted and that person is needs to be released from the hold. If they do support it, we move on to step 4, which is the attorney's office. BHA is going to send the involuntary commitment packet, which is made up of the EC application, the IC application, and the physician certificate. And the attorneys are going to draft that legal petition. And then that's the legal petition that the petitioner is going to need to get signed, which again, in most counties has to be notarized. Once the attorneys receive that signed petition, we go to step 5, which is the last step in the petition being filed. Once it's been filed with the courts, the EC then extends for an additional 10 business days, and a court hearing is going to be scheduled within those 10 business days. The petitioner will be provided a notice of hearing and is expected to appear at the IC hearing date, and the respondent will also be provided a copy of all court documentation. Next slide. So what happens if the respondent, the individual placed on the hold, wants to contest this commitment? So the respondent is going to remain at withdrawal management until that court hearing. Then at the court hearing, if the court determines there's enough evidence to place the individual on a civil commitment for substance use, the courts can commit the respondent for 90 days by statute. Or if they determine that there's not enough evidence to support it, they can dismiss the IC. If the courts dismiss the IC process is halted and the individual is made releasable immediately. Next slide. So there are a lot of limitations that come up throughout this process in regards to the process itself, and then withdrawal management facilities and treatment facilities. Some of the major ones that I've put on here are that substance use treatment facilities are not locked. And we also tend to have limited co-occurring and SUD and mental health treatment in Colorado. That's definitely improving, but it's still limited. By statute, the individual does have to be likely able to benefit from treatment. And there are certain probable medical exclusions. And some facilities don't allow controlled medications. Next slide. So this is our general contact information. If anyone is interested in a more in-depth training, please reach out to our team. As I will say, this was a very brief and condensed overview of the ECIC process, given the time restraints. So I would just like to say thank you all so much for listening. And I'm not sure how we're doing on time, if we have time for questions.
Yes, we are ahead of schedule, so we definitely have time for questions. And there, I do see one in the chat. Brooke, do you want me to read that for you?
I'm reading right now. So it says, our issue becomes how to enforce an EC in a hospital setting before the patient actually gets to a licensed withdrawal management facility. So this is where really good communication between hospital staff and withdrawal management staff comes into play. If you can work and coordinate with withdrawal management for them to actually place the EC hold while they're still in the hospital, then that hospital can detain that person by whatever their hospital policy says they can use for detainment. And I'm happy to discuss that in more depth. I know that was a brief answer to your question, but I'm happy to discuss that in more depth if you want to send me an email. There's another question that says, do outpatient providers need to obtain the ECIC endorsement in order to provide step-down services to folks on IC? Celia, I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that question, but I'm happy to get your contact information and reach back out to you. I don't believe so. I think you just need to be a licensed SUD, but I don't want to answer that with 100% certainty. So I will grab your email if you put it in the chat, and I'll follow back up with you. Other questions? Feel free to reach out to me if anybody has questions, or if
Thank you, Brooke. Jill, if you'll go to next slide, two slides. We do have time. We didn't know if we would have time, but I'm going to give a brief overview on the crisis professional curriculum, as well as the Colorado crisis assessment. Those two things went into effect in rule on January 1st, and they have now been complete and released out to the public. If you can go to next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the development of the crisis professional curriculum. When you see CPC referred to throughout here, that's what we're talking about, is crisis professional curriculum. It is based on rule, like I said. So in rule, it says that we are requiring that certain crisis modalities have crisis professionals on staff. And in order to become a crisis professional, you need to complete the BHA curriculum for crisis. And that is where this need came from. It came from a stakeholdering process where we had across the state people tell us that they needed more training for crisis to feel more confident, to feel more aware, as well as we needed to increase that workforce because it's very hard to hire individuals to work in a 24/7, 365 job, especially those working out in the field on mobile crisis and walk-in centers. And so by creating this curriculum, the idea also was that you don't have to hire bachelor's level, master's level individuals to provide a crisis response to help somebody who is in need in that moment. So those are some of the impetuses of why this was created. So the consistent baseline training for the crisis professionals that are required to take this. We had a huge stakeholdering process. I'm not going to go through a whole lot of it in here because I wanted to get more to the curriculum, but we had a lot of involvement with our community and our administrative service organizations to ensure that we were producing what was needed, what was important, and what was going to be effective. So we looked at the full crisis continuum here in Colorado, our processes, evidence-based practices, and best practices across the country, suicide screening, crisis plans, psychiatric advanced directives. We talk about diagnostics, needs, identities, phase of life, demographics of diverse individuals. One of the topic areas for our curriculum we added at the last, I'd say last hour, was ethics. And that was in order to expand and be consistent with the Community College of Aurora, because we're actually working on trying to get this to equate to college credit for their one of their initial behavioral health crisis courses. We have 5 child, youth, and family courses that were already being developed that we included within the crisis professional curriculum. Go next slide, please. Our partners in this, as I kind of already mentioned, but we did need to put out a request for proposal for this, and Dr. Ashley Brock-Baca, as well as Working Knowledge, won that bid, and they were in the creators, primarily creators of the content. We had WICHE, which is the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, as our SME content reviewers. They were amazing. We have our BHA LMS staff who actually created and got it back onto our learning management system and out for the public to start learning and taking those courses. We had APA reviews. So many of our courses right now, 23 of our courses already have continuing education units, CEUs, attached to them. And then we had our advisory committee. Our advisory committee was incredibly important. They had to review and re-review course content, starting with the course outlines, the course presentations, and then we would go back and incorporate their feedback, and then they would go back in and look at some of these again, ensuring that we had the correct information and the information that was going to be needed for their providers. And so our advisory committee consisted of 12 people other than BHA. Those were our ASO representatives. We had HICPUF. We had people on the advisory committee that had experience with what you see here, mobile crisis, crisis stabilization. So our continuum here in Colorado, as well as co-responder, crisis resolution teams. We had clinical supervisors on our advisory committee with that experience. And then we also had individuals who had worked with the crisis call center. Next slide. Our crisis professional curriculum is quite extensive. It includes 32 courses and 45 total hours of training. And it's a lot. We know that. I just want to let everybody know, remind everybody, it is free though. So you can take these courses as you are needing to, if you are needing to get that crisis professional certificate of completion, or if you're just interested in some of these, you can go in and take 1 or 2 of these if you'd like. You're welcome to take all 32 if those are of interest to you. You'll see these all listed here, and the 5 children, youth, and family are in this list as well. The ethics is that last course there, number 32. And then the course 31 is our Colorado Crisis Assessment. And that's just the kind of the training, the virtual training on the creation and what the assessment looks like and how to use it. Next slide. This is really that review process. I kind of jumped ahead and explained it already, but we have, starting with that outline from our SMEs, our subject matter experts, and then it going to our advisory committee, coming back to us and working knowledge, creating the slides and materials, going back to the advisory committee, questions being us bringing in the feedback. We had to create post-test questions as well as create a final exam, and those questions were included. We had the videos. So then once the advisory committee did approve the presentation, then our subject matter expert actually recorded what you can see online now on our LMS. And then we did one more review of that before it actually went live to ensure that videos were working, sound was good. There was, everything on the slides was still spelled correctly, all of those things before the final push over to our LMS team, who then did their own review again. So we have found there were some errors that we missed along the way and we were able to catch later. We also have the APA review that we have done now, where we have several courses that had just finished the APA review for the CEUs. And we have a couple that are going to need a couple updates before they'll have the CEU credits, but we're going to get that taken care of. So the majority of our 31 courses will have CEUs. That first course, the introductory, won't come with a CEU. If we can go to the next slide, please. Talk a little bit about the Colorado Crisis Assessment. I'm going to show it to you here. There's a link on this slide that you'll have access to, but that goes to the public folder that has our fillable PDF for the crisis assessment and the instructions. Next slide, please. So the Colorado Crisis Assessment, before it was developed, we went through a similar stakeholdering process and review process before bringing the assessment to the advisory committee. So we had a consensus around what domains were we going to include in the assessment, looking at assessments that were used across the country, best practices, and also crosswalking it with the 20-point assessment that's being used right now. Again, multiple rounds of review with our advisory committee, adjustments, changes. They actually also reviewed the instructions for us and made sure that they were clear. And I also had a mobile crisis subject matter expert review it as well, somebody who's been in the field and asked, how does this operate for you if you were in the field doing this? So again, that is why if you think about, I said this already, rule came out in January and our curriculum and assessment came out in July. We had a lot of extra time built in that we didn't account for because we did so many reviews and had so many people involved in looking at this. Next slide. These are just the first 2 pages of the assessment that you'll find in that public folder there. The first page is really your demographics and you're finding out your risk factors and what's the situation while you're there. On the second page, you'll see at the top, we have the Columbia built in, and then the questions around risk and additional questions like for your mental status exam, medical and behavioral health history. Next slide. We have, of course, our strengths and resources. What are the needs and what is the disposition? We have information on there about transportation and whether law enforcement was contacted and came to the scene or not, if this was a mobile crisis response. We have areas for signature because we understand that until this form will be built into agencies' EHRs, people may need to use the paper version or a electronic version, fillable PDF on their computer. And then you'll see at that bottom, there's that big section that's empty. That's additional notes. That's a fillable section as well, because sometimes those sections, we don't have enough room and we need more room to write. So we've just included some extra room on that back page for everyone. Next slide. And now I'm going to go back to some clarification around the rule language, because we've had a lot of questions about who needs to take the crisis professional curriculum. what modalities have to have crisis professionals. And so I've included some of the most often asked questions. So I started here with just what that crisis professional, that definition, and that's really what I talked about when I first started, which was the crisis professional is the person who's trained and has completed the BHA approved training. So that crisis professional curriculum, you get a certificate of completion, and you are able to operate as a crisis professional in the modalities that it's required. One of the other big questions we get is, do licensed professionals have an exemption from the crisis professional curriculum? And at this time, in the way that rule is written, they do not, because the way rule is written is that a crisis professional is needed to be able to lead the crisis response. So if a licensed individual is leading the mobile crisis response or is staffing the walk-in center doing the assessments, at this time they have to complete the crisis professional curriculum to be considered a crisis professional. So you'll see that information in 2 there. And number 3, I just give you the definition of the Colorado Crisis Assessment. In rule, it's referred to as crisis assessment. On the assessment, it's called Colorado Crisis Assessment. And so our mobile crisis service and our walk-in centers must administer a crisis assessment in full on the BHA created form. So that's like what I said, going back to, we understand until it can be built in and the way that your EHR can incorporate those questions. We understand you're going to have to probably use the paper version or the electronic version, PDF fillable, and we ask that you do use it as it is created. However, that gets built into your EHRs, we understand that's going to look different. We just require that you include all of the areas that are on the Colorado Crisis Assessment. And then we are asking that our ASOs then ensure that our providers have done that once their EHRs are updated. Next slide. Here are our definitions and rules around what modalities are required to have crisis professionals on staff. Our mobile crisis response, every mobile crisis team must include a crisis professional who can lead the crisis assessment and intervention. When you think of, and when it says a crisis professional, here in Colorado, we require a paired response, whether that be 2 people in person or 1 person in person and 1 virtually, but the one leading the response needs to be a crisis professional. We say both should be, but 1 must be. The walk-in crisis agency must always be staffed by a crisis professional. And then the CSU language was a little tricky, and it was a little bit harder to flush out from rule. But the CSU language says, in addition to the walk-in crisis service staffing requirements, which you see here in number 3, so that does imply, though, that CSUs need to have a crisis professional available to them if a crisis assessment were to need to be done. So at this time, that is how rule is written. And as we've kind of talked about that, we've realized that it's highly unlikely that at a crisis stabilization unit, an initial crisis assessment may be required because that's already a higher level of care. But at this time, again, that's how rule is written. And if there is an opportunity for stakeholdering in the future and potential revisions, those of you who have any opinions about that, we ask you to share them with us. Next slide. Just give everybody a heads up on the enrollment. We have over 1,100 learners who are enrolled in the crisis professional curriculum. Over 700 have already passed at least 1 course. And at the time that I was creating this, we had 87 individuals who had completed all 32 courses. I know that number's higher now, but I didn't have an opportunity to update it right before here. So it's pretty awesome to see how many learners are engaged across the state. Next slide, please. Oh, and that was it. So this is the last presentation of our provider convening meeting today, and we do have time for questions. So any questions around this presentation or any of the previous ones, please include in chat and we will try to answer as many as we can. Jill, can you help with going back and kind of, or Melissa?
Yeah, there is one
traffic on these.
There is one in the chat, and it's from Cecilia. She said, I heard the final exam was over 150 questions. That seems really daunting. What happens if someone does not pass? What is the deadline for the current crisis professionals to complete the curriculum?
Okay, so there are over 100 questions. And part of that was not only because of the need to incorporate questions from all 32 courses, but also for the ability to have the college course credit that we're working on. And so you can, a provider, a crisis professional can fail the exam 4 times. That 5th time, if it's failed, they have to go back to their supervisor at their agency and work out a plan for what next steps are. We would involve the ASOs who could then communicate with us about what we need to do to allow this person either additional being able to go back through material or whatever a plan of action can be so that we can help this individual pass that course. And there was another question there, Melissa. Was it what's the deadline? I think.
There was another one, but it was in regards to IC, involuntary commitment. Yeah.
Oh, I see. IC. Sorry, it was under. It was what's the deadline for current crisis professionals to complete the curriculum? So we have been working with our administrative service organizations, and we have talked to them about December 31st of 2024 is the deadline. If providers do not have crisis professional staff the way they need to and the modalities they need to, a waiver will need to be submitted if that is not done by December 31st of 2024. Melissa, I'm going to scroll here.
Nope, it doesn't look like there's anything else.
Okay. Okay, any last questions in our chat? Does anybody else from the BHA have anything they want to add before we conclude today? All right, well, we invite everybody back to come see us on October 17th. Will be our next provider convening. You can definitely find us here in our calendar and the QR code to get to our website. Please share feedback about the provider convening if you have any topics or ideas that you think would be helpful for us to include moving forward. We really appreciate you all coming and being here with us today. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and close out the meeting. Thank you all again.